Our teenage years can be difficult to navigate, especially considering the conflicting expectations of the adults in our lives. At some point, you may have been told you're old enough to know better, but also you're too young to understand. It is true that during the teenage years, our brains undergo significant development, but the truth is, teenage brains are fully capable of functioning as efficiently as adult brains, only they utilize different parts and usually require more energy. The brain development that occurs during the teenage years begins at puberty, which marks the end of childhood and the beginning of adolescence. For girls, this usually begins around ages 8 through 10, and for boys, ages 10 through 12, but different environmental and cultural factors can affect those margins, such as genetics, diet, stress, and even family relationships. At the start of puberty, the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which then causes the pituitary gland to release gonadotropin. Gonadotropin influences the release of sex hormones, which initiates the process of physical and mental maturation in adolescence. Most of us are familiar with the changes that happen to our bodies during puberty, but what happens to our brains during this time? Brains are composed of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter contains nerve cell bodies and synapses, and white matter is made up of axons that connect sections of gray matter. Brain development is characterized by two specific processes, myelination and synaptic pruning. Neurons have what is called a myelin sheath, which wraps around the axon and facilitates the transmission of signals between neurons. Myelination produces the myelin sheath and contributes to the formation of white matter. During late childhood and early adolescence, we experience an increase in gray matter, and we end up with more synaptic connections than we actually need. Synaptic pruning fixes this by eliminating the connections that we do not use and reinforcing the connections that we use frequently. Unlike many milestones in physical development, mental maturity is not directly related to age. Whether or not a synaptic connection is used or eliminated depends on what is happening in our surroundings, and so a person's mental maturation is greatly influenced by their experiences and environment. The area of the brain that changes the most during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the cognitive control network of the brain. This network is responsible for things such as planning, decision-making, self-regulation, social perceptiveness, and the inhibition of inappropriate behavior. This network develops gradually through adolescence and young adulthood, independent from puberty. On the other hand, the socio-emotional network, which is localized in the limbic and paralimbic areas of the brain, is especially sensitive to social and emotional stimuli and is remodeled in early adolescence with the hormonal changes of puberty. Teenagers are stereotypically risk takers, especially when in the presence of their peers, and it is the interactions between these two brain networks that earns them that reputation. Although the brain development that occurs during our teenage years is important, our brains are not fully mature until we are almost in our 30s. Perhaps we can gain a better understanding of teenagers now that we know what is going on in their brains.
Created using Powtoon.